Hello and welcome back to the Swingman podcast. Now, before we start off this episode, I just wanted to address the reason as to why there was no upload, no coverage of Game 3. I recorded the whole damn episode, 48 minutes long as per usual, and I couldn't find it. It's lost somewhere within my hard drive, and I have yet to find it. So, if I do find it, I'll probably end up uploading it. We'll see how it goes. But for right now, it would just be one of those shoulda, coulda, would've kind of moments. So yeah, whilst it is unfortunate, I can always sort of summarize my thoughts. Even though the biggest bummer that I had was that was probably one of the most passionate episodes that I've recorded in terms of how frustrated I was with the Warriors' performance. So I kind of wish you guys were able to hear everything that was said on that episode the way that it was said. But unfortunately now you're going to get a dwindled down summary of that whole episode, just because covering both topics would take around about 2 hours if I was to go in depth for 48 minutes at a time. So we're not going to do that. So to summarize what should have been the previous episode, the issues that I addressed in both games 1 and 2 of this final series are becoming more and more apparent with every game that happens. And what I mean by this is the Celtics' relentless attack in the paint, because of how clearly disadvantaged the Golden State Warriors are against guys like Rob Williams and Al Horford. And because of this, there were a lot of schemes that involved backdoor cuts and also a lot of lobs towards the rim. Now, what I will give Golden State credit for is that they weren't exactly not trying. But to reiterate what I said in the missing episode, you can't really fight genetics in this scenario. Yes, Draymond Green is one of the most nittiest, grittiest players that the NBA has ever seen. But when it comes to overall ability in terms of length and strength, the Warriors are getting outmatched a little bit, and you can see it out on the court. Not just on the defensive side of the ball, but also on offensive putbacks. So in that sense, the Celtics were able to chuck up any shot that they wanted in the hopes that those two guys in particular would get the ball. And in most cases, they did. Another reason as to why the Celtics won Game 4, simply put, Jaylen frickin' Brown. He had one of the best playoff performances, I would argue, of his career, just in terms of overall efficiency and aggressiveness on both sides of the ball. He went practically perfect in the first quarter, and that's all it really took. Like, throughout the course of Game 3, you could see that from the first quarter, his confidence built up so much to the point where he didn't really care who was in front of him. Now, I will say that Jaylen does have a significant height advantage over Gary Payton II, but let's not get it twisted. Gary Payton II is no scrub on defense. As I mentioned in Game 2's coverage, I have high praise for Gary Payton II. But he seemed largely ineffective to what Jaylen Brown was able to do on offense. And over time, I think that's just due to a high amount of confidence. When you make that many shots, when you see the ball go in that many times, you sort of feel invincible, untouchable. And obviously, seeing the defensive schemes that the Warriors are running especially when they turn to that small ball lineup. Of course, you would try to abuse the mismatch as much as you possibly can. And so because of this, because of Jaylen Brown's hot start, he was able to attack the closeouts and give other players on the floor better offensive looks. So what do I mean by this? Jaylen Brown, I think, went 3 for 3 from 3 in the opening 7 minutes. And that resulted in the defense respecting his shot. And so what you saw was, even with a simple pump fake, defenders jumped. And as soon as they jumped, he immediately attacked the paint, which is what you should do. Now, because of Jaylen Brown's threat in the paint, defenders had no choice but to close in on him to make that paint attempt harder, that layup attempt, that dunk attempt, whatever it was. They wanted to mitigate Jaylen Brown's offensive efficiency, which is the right mind state. But this leads me on to my next point about attacking the closeout. He was able to utilize things like skip passes to dart the ball to the other ends of the court, which then created wide open, and I mean wide open, threes for other players. Now, granted, I did mention that most of those looks were going to okay but largely inefficient guys from outside of the arc, a la Derek White and Marcus Smart. But again, like I said in game 1, you cannot allow your role players to get into that kind of rhythm, even though Marcus Smart isn't a role player, but you get what I'm trying to say. You can't allow those kind of players to get into a rhythm, because that just breeds overall confidence for the team. And Derek White actually torched us in game 1. I mentioned it, so listen back to that. But yeah, luckily for the Golden State Warriors, he wasn't having a particularly efficient offensive night from the floor. That being said though, they still lost. And to me, the biggest factor in that was them just being out-hustled. Whether it's on the offensive and defensive boards, or just in general diving for 50-50 balls, you saw that the Celtics players were willing to put a little bit more elbow grease into this game to eventually lead them to the 2-1 lead that they did get. And despite the series now being tied 2-2, there's still some apparent issues that I noted down from Game 3's loss that are still apparent in the Game 4 win. So we'll get into that in just a bit. But I just wanted to touch up on why I felt like the Warriors lost Game 3. For the most part, it was early foul trouble for stars like Stephen Curry. He had 3 fouls in the first half, which led him to play less aggressively on both ends of the floor. And as I've said, it can affect your rhythm, just in terms of how your game plan is and how much smarter you have to play now, knowing that you have those fouls and that the refs are watching you. The second thing I wanted to mention is the Warriors obviously went on their usual dominance in the third quarter. We did have quite a massive run, but give credit where credit is due. The Celtics defense was able to mitigate a large chunk of what that run was. Now, in my personal opinion, I thought that what happened in the third quarter, and even arguably towards the end of the second, leading into the third quarter run, would have carried us over in terms of the momentum it brings into the overall win. But obviously that's not what happened. I can't really say where we lost the momentum, but again, you just have to tip your hats off to the Celtics and how they're able to run their offense. So that's that. And just some honorable mentions before we get on to the last point and then the eventual beginning of Game 4's coverage. Klay Thompson, although he had one of his better box scoring performances in terms of points, I felt like that was one of his most inefficient performances despite what the statistics may tell you. Now, what do I mean by this? I saw a lot of forced shots from him, a lot of ill-advised shots that he wouldn't normally take. And the reason why I think that happened was just so that he could try and gain some kind of rhythm. But it ultimately led to their demise. Just in the sense of there was no patented Warriors offense. And I felt like if Klay just let the system run, he would have been able to generate a lot more open shots off dribble handoffs, screens, and cuts to the basket. So whilst scoring 25 points is a good sign, overall, I would argue that numbers aren't always everything. And that's apparent by the endgame score, losing by 16, despite your two main stars having decent performances. Obviously one better than the other, but still, decent performances from the field, resulting in a loss. Numbers don't always say everything. Now that's quite a contradictory statement, considering what I'm about to tell you in Game 4's coverage, but we'll get on to that in just a little bit. Before that though, my final point on Game 3's loss was Mr. All Bark, No Bite, Draymond Green. I don't understand how somebody with that kind of mentality, that kind of cockiness and confidence can go out in a potentially title shifting game. I don't know how we can go out and score 2 points. 2 points. Now, obviously, you've heard the term defense wins championships, and for the large part, I agree. So let's switch it to that side of the floor then. 4 rebounds. And you fouled out. How can you tell me that a Defensive Player of the Year candidate this year, an All-Star several times, and a member of the All-Defensive team, whether it be first, second, or third, several times, not to mention your Defensive Player of the Year award that you won? How can you sit there and chat all of that rubbish, all of that nonsense, and not be able to show it when it matters the most? Essentially, what I thought of Draymond Green's actions, as I said in the last episode that you guys have seen, Draymond Green walks the line between aggressiveness and stupidity, and that could not be more apparent in his actions previously. And so what I thought of Draymond Green's actions was cowardly, in the sense that he was talking all this smack, and yet he was leaving it up to guys like Steph, Klay, and Wiggins to essentially walk the walk. And that's something that you cannot do as a so-called champion. Now, just before we get into Game 4's coverage, I just briefly wanted to mention an opinion stated by Stephen A. Smith on his First Take episode when talking about Draymond Green's performance. He said that the Warriors have been deprived of 2 championships because of the results of Draymond Green's actions, which in large part I agree with. Obviously, there were a few choke jobs by Steph in that 2016 run, which ultimately led them to lose. But Draymond Green got ejected in Game 5, which was debatably the turning point of that series. And there's no doubt about it. He hit LeBron James in the nuts. Like, as much of a Warriors fan as I am, he hit LeBron James in the nuts. So he crossed that border, as I said, between aggressiveness and stupidity, and it cost us a championship. In this series, he's doing it again. So as a Warriors fan, it's very frustrating to see somebody like Draymond Green out on the floor. And I'll talk about the consequences of his actions because he was benched in the fourth quarter of a pivotal game. But I just don't like seeing Draymond Green assert himself as this dominant defensive threat when 1, he's getting out-muscled, out-hustled, and 2, he's not being the smart player that he's known to be. I know that he doesn't provide on offense, and 2 points is considered somewhat normal for somebody of his stature. But my point is, if you're going to talk that talk, be ready to walk the walk. And if you can't provide on offense, provide on defense. And you saw none of that in his performance. So I think we've spoken long enough about Game 3. So let's move on to Game 4. Just to preface this episode by saying that the majority of my topics are going to be fairly short because I felt like there's similarities between Game 3 and Game 4's performances for both teams were sort of similar. But what you'll come to find throughout the duration of this episode is that there are just a few minute and obviously massive, if you know and have watched the game, massive points as to why one team won over the other team. So let's jump straight into it. The Golden State Warriors win 107-97 on the road in a pivotal Game 4 against Boston in the TD Garden. Now, what's reason number 1 as to why I think the Warriors won? The obvious one, Steph Curry's absolute explosion on the offensive end, scoring 43 points alongside 10 rebounds and 4 assists. Now, being a fan of the NBA, you would know that a performance like that isn't necessarily out of Steph Curry's abilities. But what makes his performance even more impressive was how he responded to not only the huge ego blow in Game 3, but also he had quite a scary moment in the fourth quarter. And a lot of Warriors fans, myself included, were holding their breaths in the hopes that Steph Curry would still be okay after diving for a loose ball and being landed on by Al Horford. Now, the topics I'm going to address here are twofold. 1, I'm really impressed with how Steph was able to dive on that 50-50 ball despite a traumatic incident happening to him towards the end of the season, which I believe led him to miss 13 to 16 games against the same team, mind you. Marcus Smart, towards the end of the regular season, goes for a loose ball and inadvertently injures Steph. Now, if you've kept up with Warriors history over the past couple of years, and how could you not have, because of how many finals runs that they've had over the years, Steph Curry is known to have fragile ankles, and that was really apparent in his first couple of seasons in the NBA. But over time, with his strength and endurance training, he was able to sort of mitigate the amount of injuries he had on the lower half of his body. But despite this, whenever as a Warriors fan, you see Steph go down with an ankle injury in particular, you aren't always hopeful of the best. So, he was injured that first time, yet he was still able to dive for the ball, knowing the potential risks. And obviously, it didn't pay off well, but just the hustle and determination to win was really admirable from Steph. And obviously, as I just said, he went off for 43 points. So it really shows you his willingness to win, his grit, his determination that I don't feel a lot of the players on the Warriors squad currently have. Draymond Green. And topic number 2, a lot of people, especially Warriors fans, which is understandable, have addressed the potential issue of it being a dirty play. Now, what do I think about it? Of course it's not a dirty play. The same goes for the Marcus Smart play on the ball towards the last handful of games in the season. I don't think either of those plays was a dirty play, and it's one of the fundamentals of basketball, just in terms of how you hustle for loose balls. However, it is unfortunate that it had to happen to a star player like Steph, who, as you can see in Game 4, they heavily needed in order to pull out a win against this Boston Celtics team. But what I will say is, when you make a play on the ball like that, every player, and I mean every single player, knows the potential risks of diving for loose balls. But again, sacrificing your body is one of the things that establishes good teams from great teams. The willingness to win, as I keep saying, is what establishes good from great teams. So of course it wasn't a dirty play. However, there was a 3-point attempt in Game 4, which ultimately got called a flagrant 1. And if you don't know what play I'm talking about, it's Al Horford, totally coincidentally, I might add, getting into the landing space of Steph Curry, causing him to fall. And if you watch the replay, he kind of lands on Al Horford's foot a little bit. So fortunately, it didn't sort of spiral into anything worse than what it already was. Again, I'm not 100% sure that it was necessarily a dirty play, but it was a dirtier play, and I use that term with a grain of salt. It was a dirtier play than the previously mentioned dive ball on Steph Curry. And the pretty ironic thing is, the rule that's now currently put in place when talking about the defender not being able to enter the shooter's landing space, that was put in place because of the Golden State Warriors and the infamously dirty play that Zaza Pachulia did on Kawhi Leonard. Do I think that was a dirty play? Abso-freaking-lutely. If you watch the replay, you could see him shuffle forward. And during the playoffs, it would be stupid of you to assume that players aren't scouting other players for potential weaknesses, injuries, etc. So do I believe that play from Zaza was dirty? Of course. Now Al Horford, considering he was the one that could have injured Steph, that makes him more aware than others of his current situation. So you could make the argument that it could have been a dirty play. But I'll leave that up to you guys. And also, whilst we're on this topic of conversation, I do feel like there were a lot of calls that didn't go Steph's way in terms of 4-point plays. You could see that he was visibly getting frustrated from the lack of calls. And in all fairness, I agree with him. And the officiating for a large part has been one of the biggest controversies in not just this finals, but other finals throughout the years as well. But I'm not here to talk about officiating because I can't speak about officiating since I'm not an officiator. So you guys can debate in the comments whether you think some calls were biased or unfair or downright ignored. Just debate that in the comments. I'll try and get back to you on that one. But back on topic a little bit. Despite Steph's amazing performance, I don't think that it necessarily grants them a win. And what I mean by this is, Steph obviously got injured the last game, and he's Obviously not 100%. But for you guys to go out onto the floor, knowing this, by the way, for you guys to go out onto the floor and let him score and carry the team the way you did, speaks to just how much Warriors players need to step up. Because your next best player in Klay Thompson had 18. Your third best player had 17. So you can obviously see the clear disparity in scoring efficiency that this team has. And my concern is, knowing how good the Celtics are, this series is likely to go to 7 games. Now, do I want it to be shorter? Absolutely. Of course I want it to end in 6, but you can never be too optimistic about your chances. So knowing how good the Celtics are, you cannot depend on one player, especially the player who is arguably 80 to 90% of his full capacity. You can't depend on him to carry you to the Larry O'Brien trophy, especially because he already does so much on offense just to get an open shot, that the wear and tear on his body has to be a considerable factor in whether you guys win the chip or not, especially considering how he's targeted on defense. So essentially he's working on both ends of the floor and he still has to carry 14 men to the finals. Like, I hope you know how ridiculous that sounds, to expect that much from one person. That's not to undercut his abilities, because I know that he can do it. But at the same time, that's not what Warriors basketball is. We're not the Houston Rockets in the James Harden era, because we all know how that turned out. He's never going to win a ring because of his style of play, and that's what differentiated the Warriors from all the other teams: ball movement and offensive efficiency. Now, in saying that, Andrew Wiggins had one of the best performances of his career. It's not even debatable at this point. He did have one of the best games of his career, despite him only scoring 17 points. His overall aggressiveness on both ends of the floor is what really pulled the win out for the Warriors when you talk about the secondary option besides Stephen Curry. He had 16 rebounds in this game, which is obviously surprising to most people, but to those who know about Wiggins and his God-given athletic abilities, you would assume that that's a regular statistic for him, but it's not. So I think when you talk about the potential X factor in the Warriors winning the championship or them losing it, Andrew Wiggins has to be a focal point in that conversation because of his reputation as a so-called scrub, a so-called bum, somebody who gives no effort. He has to change that script for himself, continue to be aggressive, continue to fight for the championship, to clear his name. And is he capable of doing that? Absolutely. But as we all know, basketball is more than just a physical game. It's all about mentality. And Andrew Wiggins, despite his all-star selection this year, has yet to prove that he is the fighter that the Warriors need him to be. Another thing that I wanted to note about Steph Curry's performance, not regarding his shooting, but his finishing. In this game, Steph really showed how he was able to make the offensive adjustment when driving to the rim. Now, in that episode that went MIA, I mentioned that the length and strength of Boston was really affecting their shot selection when driving to the rim in fear of getting blocked. And in this game, it's more prevalent now than ever because Robert Williams was just deflecting every single shot attempt at the rim. And the reason why I'm giving Steph Curry so much praise when talking about how to figure out scoring inside the paint is because if you've watched Steph Curry's career, besides shooting, he was really known for scoring high floaters and high layups off the glass, like to the point where it was unblockable. And in Game 4, he really showed his finishing skill set in that regard. So it was nice to see, not only as a Warriors fan, but just for overall nostalgia of how he used to play. I think if the Warriors are really going to beat this team inside, Steph Curry is going to have to put on one of those vintage performances where he shows what he's able to do in the paint. Moving on to my second point, Jordan Poole. Although he didn't have a stellar performance, he did arguably have one of the better performances of this playoff run. And it says a lot considering he only scored 14 points. That's how bad he's been playing throughout this series. But the point that I will make is familiarity breeds confidence. And I know the original saying is familiarity breeds content. But in this sense, I feel like Jordan Poole, because he's played the Celtics for this many games, he understands now how they are playing him. And he's able to abuse that. Whether it's shooting straight out of a dribble handoff or driving to the rim and showing his offensive ability. So I have no doubt that somebody like Jordan Poole will step up for missing guys like Klay Thompson in this case. Moving on to my final point on why I felt like the Warriors won Game 4. In my opinion, the role players really stepped up defensively when you talk about limiting opportunities for players like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. The player I wanted to outline is Nemanja Bjelica. I've spoken about his impact on his limited minutes on the floor, but this was one of his best showings in terms of what he's able to do when guarding star players that I've ever seen out of him. Now you have to note that Bjelica isn't a super nimble and athletic player, but he is a smart one, not only on defense, but on offense as well. The reads that he makes are sort of unlike what a big man is known to do. And part of that is just the European style of play. It's obviously different from the United States in terms of fundamentals of basketball. But I also feel like that goes on the defensive end as well. If you've seen EuroLeague basketball, you know how tough and aggressive it gets in there. So I feel like Bjelica is more than capable of understanding the task, more than physical and more than experienced of handling the task. So just a brief side note before we go on to my points about the Celtics. Well done to Bjelica for performing when it matters the most. Moving on to the Celtics, however, in my personal opinion, and it might be an obvious one, if Steph did not have that breakout performance in Game 4, the Warriors would have absolutely lost that game and would have been down 3-1 to Boston. As I said at the very start of this episode, the majority of my points are going to be quite repetitive in the sense that the Boston Celtics played the same way that they did in Game 3. But I think it just goes to show you the common phrase of good defense, but better offense. But let's just talk about a few points that I noticed throughout the game. Number 1, although Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown were able to have good offensive performances throughout the last 2 games, I feel like the Warriors are kind of not necessarily figuring them out, but they are making shots extremely difficult for them. And this is more so a point geared towards Jason Tatum as opposed to Jaylen Brown, because as I said, his Game 3 performance was unlike anything I've ever seen before out of him thus far, especially when you talk about the third quarter. But for Jason Tatum, much like Klay Thompson, I don't think he's really comfortable out there on the floor. And to any statistics heavy person, they would disagree with me because of his obvious box score numbers. But just watching him throughout the entirety of both of those games, actually scratch that, throughout the entire series, because if you remember, the Celtics did win Game 1, but Jason Tatum only scored, I believe, 12 points, and they came to lose Game 2. So you could obviously tell that offensively he wasn't performing to bring his team to that Game 2 win. So my point is, despite everything that's gone on throughout this series in terms of which team is currently winning at the moment, yes, the Celtics are a better overall team, but when you talk about individual performances, the Warriors' star player in Steph Curry is clearly outshining the Celtics' best player in Jason Tatum. And that's largely due to experience, in my opinion. Steph is obviously more seasoned as a player. So for Jason, especially with it being his first finals appearance in his career, you have to kind of shake off those nerves a little bit. But I'm going to make the same point that I made about Klay Thompson to Jason Tatum. And that is, if you cannot figure out a way to become beneficial in your role to the team, then you will be the reason why they lose. And that's as simple as I can put it. Now, the fact that I'm saying this when Jason Tatum has averaged around 20 points a game, the fact that I'm saying this, critiquing him so hard, is a testament as to who I feel like Jason Tatum is, which is obviously a much better offensive performer than he currently is. Because for any quote-unquote average Joe in the league, 20 points per game is more than enough. But for me, knowing what I know of Jason Tatum, my standards are a lot higher than what the average fans would be. So despite that, there's not really much more I can say about why I felt the Celtics lost that game, because in all honesty, I felt like they could have won it. And the Warriors should be fortunate that Steph Curry was able to perform the way that he performed in Game 4. And the dependency is what scares me the most. So when just looking at it from this perspective of one team that's dependent on one player and another team that has a more balanced scoring attack, of course the team that is more selfless is going to win. And in my opinion, that's the Celtics if they're able to get it together. But seeing as though we've covered both games, let's just give an overall summary before we close out this episode. Now, as of when I'm recording this, the Warriors play tonight back home for Game 5. And I'm just praying, practically pleading at this point, that they can get it done to have the overall advantage and close it out in 6. But you never know with this kind of game. My hope is that they win Game 5, take it to Boston. If they manage to close it out in 6, then great. But as a fan, I cannot honestly tell you that I am confident that this series will end in 6. The only hopeful thing is that for Game 7, the most important game of the finals run, for obvious reasons, will be back in San Francisco. So hopefully the home crowd are able to play a factor in the Warriors ultimately winning the final series. But again, it's not one of those ones that I can be 100% confident on, but I just have to knock on wood and rely on luck at this point. So, some of the issues and points that I wanted to raise before we get out of here is that this series is really going to go down to experience versus energy. And what I mean by energy is stamina. The Celtics are obviously the younger team out of the both of them. So it's a given that they will have more energy, more stamina, more resistance to wear and tear, as opposed to a seasoned team in the Golden State Warriors. We've obviously seen not key guys, but obviously contributors to the Warriors in Otto Porter and Andre Iguodala go down with injuries. And it wasn't necessarily in-game injuries. It was more so just the wear and tear and how age is really affecting how many minutes you're able to give on the floor with your teammates. Andre Iguodala has obviously stated that it's going to be his last season with the Warriors and ultimately the last season of his career. And rightly so. because missing that amount of time throughout a season is an obvious sign that you are not the player you used to be. So in my opinion, in order for Andre Iguodala to really be effective to this team, he should play more of a Udonis Haslem role to the team, which is essentially veteran mentorship, getting your guys over the hump, keeping them in the game mentally, and sharing your wisdom with younger players who might not understand the so-called game within the game. And going on with this topic about stamina and energy, we've seen that despite third quarter runs, the Celtics are still able to hold on and win important games. And that's just due to how much rest time each individual player needs. Now, the younger you are, it can be argued that you don't need as much rest time as some of the other players. And that's obviously evident within the numbers that both Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have contributed in terms of minutes. As it stands right now, both players are averaging about 40 minutes on the floor, which is a lot to ask of any player. And I know that Warriors players like Steph and Andrew Wiggins are averaging the same amount. But again, that point goes to the wear and tear of your body, how many ice packs you need when you're sitting down on the bench. I just feel like these young guys don't really need that rest because their bodies are more durable to what's happening over the course of the game. However, I have to also point out the apparent injuries towards both of those players. As I spoke about in the previous episode, Jason Tatum is suffering an apparent shoulder injury. I think he obtained that through the Heat series, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, he's still going through that. So it kind of remains to be seen how he'll perform, and it can be argued that the reason why he's performing the way he's performing is because of that apparent shoulder injury and not because of the nerves that the final stage brings. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts and opinions on that down below. So yeah, get at me in the comments and let me see what you guys think, and we'll debate that a little bit. But moving on to Jaylen Brown, he doesn't seem to be suffering an apparent injury, but the way that they are playing him defensively, particularly somebody like Draymond Green, who is known to be a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more aggressive, and if you've seen the clips circulating social media regarding his his technique of getting Steph and Klay open, and I'm talking about illegal screens here, because I do agree that most of the screens that he sets are illegal. Jaylen Brown obviously has a hell of a job to do because he is known as one of the best defenders on that team. So it remains to be seen how that level of physicality will affect a player like Jaylen Brown, especially if you put forward the argument that he is more of a slasher than a shooter. Obviously, on the contrary, he did go off in the first quarter of Game 3, like I said, and he is an efficient outside shooter. But he, to me, seems more of a rim runner kind of player. But as I just said, the Warriors are different from the Celtics in terms of their ability to bounce back from the aches and pains of 48 minutes of basketball. Another thing I wanted to address as well is recently, if you've been watching Draymond Green's podcast, he talked about how great teams differ from regular teams because they are able to hide their weaknesses through their strengths. And the one argument that I would put forward is, judging the way you have performed in particular, which ultimately leads to your team's performance overall, are the Warriors now an average team? Because judging off the last 4 games of this series, the Celtics have absolutely obliterated any defensive scheme that the Warriors have had, despite some of their apparent losses. And that's what I mean about Draymond Green's confidence and talking too much. He can't sit here and say that the Warriors are a great team just because the statistics say so. I believe we are top 5 in the league in defense. But seeing how they play on the floor, it completely contradicts everything that the statistics say. So when Draymond Green goes out and says, oh yeah, we'll be alright, we dominated the first, second and third quarter of game 1, to me it doesn't really seem like you're giving the Celtics the respect that they deserve, because they ultimately got this far by proving that they're one of the best defensive teams in the league. So when you talk about hiding your weaknesses with your strengths, and by weaknesses I probably assume you're talking about Jordan Poole and Steph Curry's ability to defend players like Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and arguably Marcus Smart, you are talking about beating them with offense. So now here's the flip question. How can you be talking about offense when not only in game 3 did you score 2 points, but in game 4 you also scored a whopping 2 points? Now, in all fairness, you did perform better defensively, grabbing more boards, racking up more assists, and all of that. But when you talk about offense, you shouldn't be the guy yapping your mouth. And that's with all due respect. So this leads me to my final point before we wrap up this episode. It's going to be quite a downer one. But the only way I see the Warriors winning this championship is if they are able to outscore, and by outscore I mean outshoot, the Celtics. And as much as I said the players need to step up and help Steph Curry, unfortunately, and I really do mean this, he is going to have to play on the same, if not better, level than he did in Game 4 in order for them to win this series. Because as of right now, nobody is more efficient and dependable than you. And I know that's a tall order for anybody in the league. But if you're going to make a case that you are the finals MVP, you are the finals most valuable player, now is a better time than ever to prove to not just the Boston Celtics, but to the rest of the league that you should have won it all those years ago. And with that, that's going to wrap up today's episode, so I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and click the little bell icon to be notified about when every video gets released. But until then, take care and goodbye.